how do we genuinely listen to the voice of those who are actually at the forefront of struggle? And how does that become the shaper and the determinant of the kind of work and resources we put on the table? I'm hoping that the panel will spark some thoughts in you, and we can have a rigorous debate. The technology should work fine. I'm sure we've got people monitoring the question section, the chat section. So when we do get to the part of dialogue, I'm hoping that you'll all be able to engage in a meaningful discussion. Thank you very much. Alan.
Thanks, Ashley. So it's interesting, in preparing for this conversation, I found some notes from an event that some of you might have been at in 2018, where we were talking about a changing donor practice, a shift in philanthropy. Halima and I were definitely there, as well as Louise were. And what's interesting is that between 2018 and this point, very little has shifted. And I think for most of us, if we look back historically, we're talking about 20, maybe even 30 years of the same conversation. And so today, we're trying to have a conversation with a more practical focus towards constructing a new or maybe a different solidarity practice to the one we've experienced in the past. And it's based on a series of inputs from our three panelists. I will let them introduce themselves a little bit later, and their topics, that are meant to really challenge us. They're meant to say to us, we are looking in the mirror, and what is reflected back at us is not a pretty picture. But what are we going to do about it? So these critical conversations are about asking us, how do we shift from our rhetorical position, from the things that we know and we understand them very well, to the point where we start actually doing something about the things that we know. And today's conversation starts from a particular perspective. We're talking about donor and philanthropic practice. But that donor and philanthropic practice has an effect on the way we do our work. And so this is not necessarily only a conversation about donors and philanthropy, but also a conversation about how we practice in the space of development. I know some people don't like the word, but it's an easy catch-all for the spaces that we find ourselves in. So the three inputs are intended to help us think and reflect on ourselves, on our own individual practice, on our experience of receiving and managing funding, on our experience of delivering programs. But more importantly, we want to shift the conversation from just simple reflection to a point where we start looking at opportunities for action. Now, we're not necessarily going to resolve the world's problems in this conversation. We try hard, but usually 2 hours is not enough to resolve critical global issues. But these are certainly provocations intended to start us off around some practical ideas. So what we're going to ask you to do is engage your mind in this conversation and to start thinking about what are the practical starting points for shifting the way we practice solidarity, shifting the way the current development system works, which we all know, when we reflect it, is not working as effectively as it should for people who are experiencing day-to-day struggle. So that's going to be the framing of the conversation today. So obviously Ubumbano will be presenting some reflections from Ubumbano's Solidarity Action Learning events, where we've got quite a strong critique from community-based organizations about donor practice and their ability or inability to access the systems of development and what might be hindering them. Graham Philpott is going to be presenting a challenge to us around how we practice solidarity. what are the mechanisms, what are the processes, what are the things that we do that are preventing us possibly from achieving this ambition of solidarity. And Halima Mohammed is going to speak very, very specifically from a philanthropic perspective. So what is it that philanthropy organizations that are doing well, badly? I think the well bit is going to be small. In order to advance a new way of thinking, being, and practicing in the development sector. And once those presentations are done, those inputs are made, we're going to open it up to the floor to firstly take some immediate reflections, and then we'll see how we guide the conversation from there on. But what we'd really like it to be is an engagement between all of the people in the room, not necessarily a dialogue between you as the audience and the panelists or myself. And when we get to a certain point, I will try to summarize where we are. But I will be very quiet for most of the conversation. So with that, I'd like to hand to Ongeziwe. Ongeziwe can introduce herself, and then she can kick straight into the presentation.
Thank you, Alan. Afternoon.
Afternoon.
Okay. So my name is Ongeziwe Bali, and I am from the Ubumbano project. Okay. So, as Alan has mentioned, I'll be speaking from the community's perspective. So we had a learning hub earlier this year. So partners of Ubumbano, solidarity groups, were invited to this learning hub where they learned from each other as organizations. Right? And of course, in those learning hubs, this is where we spoke about the challenges they face, what they've learned from the work that they do, etc., etc. So I'll be showing you some of the work that we did in those sessions, where they wanted to highlight the challenges that they face, right, currently in their work. So I'll be showing you a couple of images that they took to capture these challenges. So let's start from here, right? So if you look at that image, right, you'll see there's a group of people who work in the community, right, sitting around the table, and you'll see there's diversity there, right, which shows that they work with other communities, they're in solidarity with other communities to really address the different issues that they face in their communities. But you'll see there's an empty seat there, right? Can you go to the next image, please? The next slide, please. And then that seat is taken, but he's not sitting down, right? He's standing above you. So that was them portraying the kind of challenges they are facing with funding, right? So funders, they will try and source out funding to support their work, etc. But then access is not easy. And when they do gain that access, then they have to, it's like there are restrictions to it, okay? They are given guidelines on how to do the work, how to report on the work, etc., etc., which becomes then a challenge when you already know the issue that you're faced with and how you can address that issue, but then there's this criteria that you're given by funders, right, and grants, and etc., etc. Can you go to the next slide? So you can see they're trying to reach out, right, to all these different funders and yeah, to all the different funders, but it's a struggle. Now the struggle is also that which issue is more important. Okay, so you find people who are doing work that is not necessarily being supported. I'll make an example. We had Wayne from Freedoms. Now they do work where you have people who had served time, and then they finished, they served their time, but then they have challenges going back to the community. So Freedoms is there to assist them with those kind of challenges, with clearing their names, etc., etc. But getting funding for that work is a challenge compared to other work, right? So you have programs such as people are working with providing access to ARVs, to healthcare services, to, different programs, but it's a challenge. It's like now it's a fight on who deserves it more, which work deserves it more, who gets more support than the other, etc., etc. Can we go to the next slide? So they are attempting to reach out and get this funding, Please go to the next one. And then now, there are two people who are applying for the same funding. Now it's a question of who gets that funding, which one is more important, of which what is needed is that everybody should get a chance, because every work is important. They have done the research, they work in these communities, they know there's a demand for this work, there's a need for this work. So now how do we then make sure that everyone who's addressing different issues in the community gets access to this funding? So this was one of the illustrations from the conversation. So we start from the old world thinking, right? And then we see that there has been change, there has been evolution in every other aspect, and then you have collaborative, community-owned solutions from the old world thinking to that, and then we reach the end where there's community-based development, right? So there has been that evolution and transformation in all the other aspects, but not in funding, right? It's still the same, it's still rigid, it's still the same, it's still a challenge for people to gain access to that. So, and what's amazing about this is that this is people from different parts of Southern Africa doing different kinds of work, even though they are interlinked somewhere, but it's different work in different communities, and the challenge is one. They all have the same challenge. Challenge is access, right? And then it goes back to the question of who holds power, right? Who holds power, and how can we get to a point where this power is shared so that we are able to address the end goal, right? Which is the issues faced in communities. The communities have organized already. They know what the challenges are. They've done mobilizing and organizing, resource planning, all of that. But now how do we then share the power of getting access to funding and being able to fund all of these projects? It's a challenge. That was the main challenge throughout, with all the other different challenges that we highlighted in the different communities. So yeah, that was the feedback from the different communities in those two sessions. Thank you.
So maybe just so you get a sense of how the images were generated. So groups came together, discussed particular issues, and they were asked to reflect their challenges in a creative way. And so the pictures that you saw were actually the groups themselves trying to transmit those messages of power and hierarchy and access and lack of access. And the cartoons were also another product where people were asked to try to tell this particular story, this thing that they were grappling with, in a way that others could understand it. And so the images are useful reflection points for that. And I suppose the other thing just to say is that the images were interpreted in so many different ways. There's some beautiful narratives that I hope you get to read when you finally get them published, around how people are experiencing the world and how they transmit those ideas. Thank you. Great. Great. Over to you.
Right. Hi everyone. Oh, that was quite good. Hello. Hello, it's good to know you. It's great to hear that you're here. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I always get very uncomfortable when they say you're here to provoke and ask questions. Why? What's the provocation that's going to happen? So I hope our discussion together is a provocative discussion. And that it gives us space to raise questions together. And then I quite like that you sort of broadened it from philanthropy and donor to a broader sense of development practice. Because I think the issues and challenges we face are not just the domain of philanthropists and donors. It's within the development sector. It's the development practice itself, which we all, in our own ways, in our own roles, buy into. And so I think it's important for us to think it through. So as we talk this afternoon, it's a bit interchangeable, but clearly with a focus on the role of resources and how we use and respond to those. I want to begin with a quote from John Steinbeck's novel of the Great Depression in the US called The Grapes of Wrath. Some of us might remember it. And I just wish in reading the quote that I could present it with a lovely Southern American accent. I just can't. Forgive me. It's a quote from a character called Annie Littlefield. And Annie Littlefield says, "If a body's ever took charity, it makes a burn that don't come out. If you ever took it, you don't forget it." I did. Last winter, and we was a-starving. Me and Pa and the little fellas, and it was a-raining. The fella told us to go to the Salvation Army. Her eyes grew fierce. We was hungry. They made us crawl for our dinner. They took our dignity. I hate 'em. Her voice was fierce and hoarse. "I hate 'em," she said. "I ain't never seen my man beat before, but them Salvation Army done it to him. They took our dignity." It's not so much about what they gave, but more deeply about what they took. They took our dignity. Is it about how they gave, their stipulations, their intentions, the amount, the frequency, the conditionalities? Or maybe, but more profoundly, it's about what they took. They took our dignity, and her man was beat. Well, comrades, beyond Annie Littlefield, does this resonate? Does it sound familiar? In the development world, we hear so much from the resource giver, the subject. But what of the targeted receiver, the object? I'm grateful to Paulo Freire, one of my heroes, who once again helps us to see this in a systemic way and provides language that captures the harshness of it. So here's Paulo Freire, a quote from him. "Any attempt to soften the power of the oppressor in deference to the weakness of the oppressed almost always manifests itself in the form of," listen to the phrase, "false generosity." False generosity. Indeed, the attempt never goes beyond this. In order to have the continued opportunity to express their generosity, the oppressors must perpetuate injustice as well. An unjust social order is the permanent fount of our generosity, which is nourished by death, despair, and poverty. Thank you, Paulo Freire, for your harsh language. A harsh language that names a false generosity. But unfortunately, a generosity that's the common experience. A generosity that makes a burn that don't come out. We've professionalized this generosity. We call it philanthropy, we call it funding, we call it development. And we've made it our business to be the subjects that set the trends, the methodologies, the indicators, and we've even provided the labels for our objects. Some we call OVCs, some we call the beneficiaries, so that we and they are clear about their place in the world as it is. We know where we belong. We become much more organized than the Salvation Army in taking people's dignity. This cannot be the generosity, the charity, the philanthropy, the development practice that we can be aligned with. It cannot be. A generosity and social order which is nourished by death, development, and despair. We cannot enact a generosity that perpetuates the justice to which it is responding. It just leaves a lot of beaten people. In Frere's description of the false generosity, he very helpfully places it right in the context of the relations of power. Power between the oppressor and the oppressed, in the context of an unjust social order. He doesn't mince his words. I think this is very helpful that he names it like this, because how we think about power may either serve to reproduce and reinforce power structures and the relationships and deny agency, or alternatively, it may challenge and subvert them. And unless we make them explicit, our normal response is just to reproduce them. And so, questions of power. The common experience of power, I think, can be described as that of power over. Very simple shorthand, power over. An experience of domination, in which the powerful set the agenda and can demand our compliance. In this kind of view, power is something that is finite. There's a limited resource. There's not enough of it to go around. There's only a certain amount of power. And so if someone has more, it means that somebody else has less. And because it's a limited and scarce resource, it's always contested. It's always fought over. And we always seek to get more of it. You can see how Frere's false generosity lives within this reality of power, the finite sense of power. And it sustains the unjust social order and the taking of our dignity. To borrow a phrase from another writer, Abu Jamal, from another context, this kind of generosity and philanthropy and development practice, it seems to be, and this is his phrase, dehumanization by design. Not by mistake, but by design. Somehow into the very structures and practices and the thinking that we've established. Its intent is to maintain and sustain the distortion of power and our humanity. Dehumanization by design. And in Annie's words, it leaves a burn. We need a rethink. We need some new thinking and acting that opens up space. Space for the new, for life, for dignity to emerge. I want to borrow a phrase from a writer from the US, Corey Walker, in his theological reflection. He suggests that what is needed, and he has this long phrase, what is needed is a re-territorialization of the project. It's a horrendous term, isn't it? It doesn't quite make sense in English. A re-territorialization of the project. But I quite like it because you stumble over it and it causes you to think. It stops you in your tracks. We have to find new territory. It's an elaboration of a style of thinking and acting that establishes new coordinates, new foundation points for the possibility of a new thinking and of new humanity. Quite simply, I think we need to shift the ground. New territory. We need to shift the ground of our praxis to move out of the domain of power over and explore dynamics of new forms of power. And I just suggest some new terms of power with and power within. You see, we can't get away from the reality of power. And so we have to articulate it in new ways and practice it in new ways. And shift from power over to maybe power with, solidarity, and power within. You hope then that power can bring about meaningful change, particularly when it's done collectively with others. This means that it opens a possibility for all of us to see ourselves as potentially powerful, as agents of change that changes the unbalanced power relations. I want us to go back for a moment to Frere for some inspiration. See, he got us into the problem of the false generosity. He dumped us there. Does he offer any hope? Well, interestingly, he does suggest what he thinks could be a true generosity. and he locates it again within the relations of power. He doesn't run away from it. Freire suggests that only power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed will be sufficiently strong to free both the oppressed and the oppressor. It's a fundamental shift he makes. He shifts the ground on which we stand. Where will there be sufficient power to change the world of the power over? He says the only place that is sufficient is from the weakness of the oppressed. He then suggests true generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity. True generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the cause of the false charity. A shift away from the false to a true, finding a different source of power, a different nature of power, not power over, but power with. And the only power that is sufficiently strong to free both the oppressed and the oppressor is the weakness of the oppressed. The fundamental shift. We in the development world, we think that the oppressed, in their weakness, well, we know what they need. They need workshops. They need training. They need capacity building. They need exposure visits. They need policy advice. You name it, we have a term for it, of what they need. Freire says, the only source of power that's sufficiently strong to free us both is from that very weakness itself. So how do we make the shift? How do we find a new place to stand in the shifting ground? I'm going to go back to Cory Walker again. And he suggests a term that I think is so provocative. He suggests that as we... sorry, I've lost my place. As we look at questions of the imbalance of power, he suggests that we look at this phrase, the wounds of development. The wounds of development. And for me, this picture just opens up the possibility where we're not moving from a position of power where we know, where we have solutions, where we have answers. But rather, he talks about the wounds of development. And in this formulation, thinking of the wound of development is to confront a festering sore. The sore, the wound, of dominant and dominating forms of development that have found their way to close out, to silence, to belittle, to undermine any other practices of thinking and forms of life that articulate new and fresh perspectives of development and freedom. The wound of development. It directs our attention to practices of thinking and forms of life shaped by memories and experience of suffering. Not from places of conquest, not from places of victory, but rather from places of suffering, both our memories and current experiences. The wound of development turns our attention to those who have known the burn of their dignity being taken. It's another kind of logic which resists the dominant regimes of thought and existence. My sense is it's based on an ethic of humility and hospitality, welcoming and being open to the new. Indeed, such a practice of thinking, being aware of its own brokenness, I think might prove in the end to be a better guide than the practice of solutions and outcomes. Adorno has a very painful saying. He puts it like this and says, the splinter in your eye is the best magnifying glass. The splinter in your eye, the wound which we inflict upon ourselves, and we're too quick to see the log in the other. But can we see the splinter in our own eye? Because that becomes our best magnifying glass to open up new possibilities. The writer Alice Walker, in a book entitled In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, a collection of women's prose, she dedicates this book to her daughter. And I love her dedication. She says, "To my daughter Rebecca, who saw in me what I considered a scar and redefined it as a world." Redefined the scar as a world. We see the connection when the splinter becomes the magnifying glass. If we are honest enough to confront the wound of what we have done and our own woundedness, it has the potential to open a whole new world. I think such a critical practice is an expression of a mode of being in which practices and thinking are intimately connected with the stories, the cultures, the habits of life that elaborate new modes of being, new modes of existence across space and time. What's this mean for philanthropy, for funding, for our development practice? Well, I just note a few points. I think it's a philanthropy of doers, of both subjects and objects, not just targets and beneficiaries. I think it's a philanthropy that explores and creates organizational forms and practices that express and affirm our dignity. Not take it, but build on the basis of our dignity. It's a philanthropy or a development practice that abandons assumptions that it's the agency of the powerful that matters. That is a place of conquest. It's a philanthropy that is based in the hands and minds of people who have nothing. Isn't that interesting? A contradiction in terms. Philanthropy is normally about those who have. It's based in their hands. I want to suggest our development practice is actually based in the hands and the minds of the people who have nothing. The power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed, as Freya suggests. Well, I think that such a praxis, if I use some words from Holloway, may be just the emerging of some cracks, some spaces and moments in which we assert a different type of doing, cracks where we walk in the opposite direction, cracks which are explorations in our politics of dignity. Thank you.
Thank you. Some really powerful images that I hope you hang on to as we have this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Glenn, for getting us started on this conversation, which I think is really timely, but which we're also having time and time again. The three of us were sitting on a panel here a couple of years ago, I don't remember, talking about very much the same things. And Graham and I were talking earlier on about how we both went down and looked at our notes from a 2012 conversation that we had had and how much had not changed. And so I think we have to do some serious introspection around this juncture between our discourse and our practice. And why is that so? And what does that mean? I want to start with two quotes. The first says, "I exist when I have an idea for a project, but the rest of the time I practically do not exist." And the second one says, are we better?
No, it's not in the system. So it's just
So we just,
I think you'll have to speak a little bit. I suspect that the online peeps might be struggling a little bit.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So I want to start with 2 quotes. The first is, I exist when I have an idea for a project. For the rest of the time, I practically do not exist. And the second one says, it's not a relationship. It's just people collaborating on an activity. Both these quotes are from a few months back from 2 young activists who are talking about their interactions with donors. Activists who've been involved in a process of working with donors over a long time, trying to get systems to change. And despite that work, this is where they are in that one. Despite the changes our sector has been talking about, sentiments such as these really need to give us time to pause. So on the discourse front, we've been having conversations on decolonization, localization, DEI, trust-based philanthropy, movement building, shifting power. They're now everywhere. And the philanthropic sector is being pushed from outside by civil society and by individuals within the system to engage on these. So we see the needle shifting slightly in some cases. Today, no progressive philanthropy conversation happens without one or more of these terms appearing front and center. We're seeing more calls for long-term, flexible, generous support grants. We're seeing new participatory approaches and mechanisms emerging. We're seeing commitments to locally led agendas, explorations on movement support, and internal and external conversations on what it means to have diversified and inclusive agenda setting. Great, on paper. Setting aside for a minute how our semantics at times deepens the problem at hand. We've had a lot of that with many of these terms because we haven't interrogated what they mean for our practice enough. The heart of our conversations have been reflecting on how dominant approaches, structures, and relationships in philanthropy have either severely limited the advancement of a more just society, or in other cases deeply exacerbated injustice. Looking only at the discourse in the philanthropic sector, one can easily assume there's been a momentum shift. But we know that the reality does not bear that out. Transforming our philanthropic sector is both personal and political. It's about institutional systems and practices, but it's also about fundamentally challenging our values, our cultures, our worldviews, and our beliefs. The work of the former, which we want to focus on, cannot happen without in-depth work on the latter. So as we see calls for changes in practice, we have to constantly be mindful. Are we fiddling while Rome burns? Are we tweaking practices individually without addressing the deep-seated ideological reasons for why transformation in our system is needed? And then think about what does that mean for developing holistically transformed systems in line with that value base. So what happens? You tweak the grant term from 1 year to 2 years. But as a Black Feminist Fund, they'll tell you they're aiming for 8-year grant objectives because that's what they see is the minimum long-term investment to start to build a strong space of change. We shift additional resources from project to flexible to general grant support. But we're specific around who we do that with. We choose people who align within our theories of change, whose work builds into our notions of impact, who represent hierarchical institutional structures that we're comfortable with supporting. We know they can report to us in ways that fit within our systems. They rock the boat, but not too much. They organize and they show dissent in ways that we think are appropriate. And that blinds us. Many radical changes are emerging from civic spaces that are not part of our professionalized nonprofit sector. But we still not explored enough what it means to support this vast array of civic spaces, because they exist as sites of agency, or what it means to support diverse civic action in ways that connects and works, rather than segmenting based on the form they take. We put money into participatory funds, into collaborative pots, experimental initiatives, and we say we're committed to changing the system. But when the other 90% of our budgets are still programmed in ways that reinforce the dominant system, letting go of 5% or 10% is ultimately not progress. The fact that we see that as a win is problematic. And are we not past the evidence-building part? Everything in our discourse tells us what we need to do, what the values that we say we're subscribing to require us to do. But we use experimentation and evidence building as screens for not fully committing. but still retaining control over agendas that we believe are needed. And we look for evidence based on our existing frameworks, not as an iterative process. We set aside funds for small grants, but we overwhelm them with bureaucracy, and we tag along capacity building that's geared to helping them fulfill our requirements. Or we add on clauses that gently talk about being accompanied by guidance, when we know what that means. We commit to more inclusive philanthropy, but we decide what we want to listen to, who we want to listen to, how often, and on what issues. And we asked for that, and we do that listening based on our own narratives of what the problem is. It's never, ever a blank slate. We set the parameters for what's up for discussion and the narrative within which that discussion happens. And ultimately, whatever the consultative process is, it's us that decides. And then we talk about mutual accountability. But once we decide, have we ever gone back to those that we consulted and said, this is why we made the choices we did. This is what worked, this is what didn't. Do we talk to them of how our bureaucratic institutional systems, our boards, our risk profiles, make some of their recommendations palatable and throw others out the window? Do we have frank conversations about how leadership changes, institutional politics, and our impact frameworks limit the kind of issues and spaces we support? When we commit to inclusion, but information is only extracted and unidirectional, can we truly say we commit to accountability? We make application forms simpler, but we double down on reporting and compliance. Even though our emergency COVID protocols show we have much greater flexibility than we say we do. We talk about intersectional programming, but the analysis informing our programming needs to be much more to understand what does lived intersectionality looks like. Obviously, we talked about people having to choose, but their lives are not lived in single issues, right? And we have rationales for why we change this much and only this much. Those we say out loud. Our constitutions don't allow us to work this way. This is what good practice is with global funders, or legally we're obliged to undertake this level of detail. But constitutions can sometimes be changed where there's enough political will. Scale is not the arbiter of good practice. And the laws we actually have demand only certain elements. The rest we willingly instituted from an imported compliance and trust deficit mindset. And I think we have to ask ourselves why we've done so. And then there are the rationales we don't often say openly enough, about not being comfortable with reputational risks that may emerge, about how institutional dynamics and leadership ideas limit the nature of our strategies, or how brand relevance of politics influences what we can be seen to support or not. These are very real restrictions we have to deal with. Our rationales, whether internally or externally acknowledged, continue to be repeated with limited interrogation about what this says for how we see our roles within the philanthropy sector and the global development system. And that role discussion is about ideology, not practice. Solidarity practice demands that our work, from narrative to practice, centers those who live the injustice and seeks to build relationships of support that further their priorities for change at multiple levels. But transformation of our practice has been limited because ideologically, our work still centers us. And I want to talk quickly about 4 ways in which the centering happens. The first is around instrumentalization. Despite good intentions, we have in many ways instrumentalized those we support to advance change on issues that we think are the most vital. But solidarity in practice demands that irrespective of issues, the idea of agency is central. Amartya Sen talks about development as enabling people to live the lives they have reason to value, and ensuring the capabilities for that are in place. As philanthropic actors, we don't give agency, but we can work in ways that enable space for people's agency to dominate what a just society looks like. Work in ways that address the barriers that inhibit their agency, and then think about what does L-Shap look like. In our current ways of working, we rarely do either deeply enough. Our top-down narratives of change, our processes of operation, and focus on siloed, issue-based areas, both crowd out and inhibit rooted in intersectional social justice agendas. Even when we think we're being progressive and we're supporting these movements, we really support them because they are sites of agency. We support them when issues they highlight align with the thematic agendas we have. So rethinking why we do what we do and how is necessary. We have to think about long-term relationships that are decommoditized. They do not exist only when we provide money. but see these relationships as part of a politicized philanthropy that really is about making our work being service, our work, our assets, our resources, being service of those that we support. For the most, the types of institutional systems and processes that align with that philosophy are very different to what we currently have. The second thing I want to talk about is whose narrative of change is centered. What transformation looks like is deeply informed by whose knowledge base is informing what constitutes transformation. Who's convening the platforms and deciding who's invited to those debates? Whose perspectives set out the narratives of those debates? Whose views determine the appropriate parameters for what systems and structures should be changed and what should be left alone? And whose agenda determines the extent to which we approach transformation from an ideological or a technical basis? Despite the rhetoric, the narrative of change is still very much centered on our analysis, on our framing, on our knowledge base. And so strategies for change and assessments of what constitutes meaningful change are developed from the inside out. We use our own frame of reference as the basis to assess what practices can be accommodated and what cannot. And it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. The third way we're centering ourselves is around relevance. So we've structured our systems and our processes around the notion of efficiency and impact. But we're talking about our efficiency and our impact first. Our processes and systems are geared to make us work, to run more seamlessly without enough consideration about what this means for those we support or the progress of the work. And the practice limits the substance. This approach fundamentally shapes how restrictive or supportive our practice is. And then we send our impact models and we program in ways that seeks to build in evidence that we're on the right track. But what would it mean for our programming in practice if we thought about ways to build a narrative of impact iteratively, based on what those who are doing the work value? What would it mean if we rethink what we mean by scale to look at depth other than breadth? What would it mean to assess our impact not on programmatic lines, but in relation to our relevance in service of those who we support? We need to flip that conversation. And the last one I want to talk about, Grant talked about power with and power over, and we're having a lot of conversations around ceding power and shifting power. But how much are we having conversations around enabling space for organizing power? Our discourse on power still centers us, those who hold the power. And our efforts are about the nature and extent of change we deem appropriate and relevant. But this can be as little or as much as we decide. And we often end up with an idea of transformation that discomforts the system, but it doesn't fundamentally change it. But we can live with discomfort very, very easily. But power isn't a zero-sum game, and we need to be thinking much more about centering the power of those who live the injustice, and then figuring out what does allyship and solidarity mean in that context. It could mean many things. It could mean enabling spaces for the power of our constituencies to strengthen, spaces for other perspectives and social change to flourish, or for new systems that fundamentally challenge our ways of being and doing. Perhaps it's time we focus on the alternatives as the center.
Thank you, Elena. So before we open up the conversation, I just want to make a note and ask people not to do the traditional, which is now that moment of self-flagellation. That's right. We get to this point, we've heard the critique, and then everybody steps up and says, I'm sorry, we know that we're bad, we know that this, but then we leave the room without actually having the conversation about what do we do differently. So my call for today is skip the self-flagellation, right? Bleeding backs, we all know we have it. And we can carry on and we'll get our antiseptic tomorrow. Today I'd like us to bleed, to feel the wound, to experience the burn, and ask ourselves, what do we do about it? What are the practical starting points for us to shift this narrative, to do something different, and create the kinds of systems that people have been calling for the last, I don't know how many decades. And in all of this calling, all we've simply done is mea culpa, did our penance, and went back and did the grand Christian thing of repeat offense, and arrive again and mea culpa, do your penance, and come back and practice it exactly the same way. This is a call for us to take responsibility in this conversation and to talk about the things that we're going to actively do in order to create change. So that's my call for the rest of this afternoon, is can we have critical engagement around the things that we need to change and how we might start along that path. So what I'd like to do now is to just open up the floor for immediate reflections, whether they're questions of clarity or any comments from anybody on the floor. I'm hoping somebody's just watching the chat box and will be able to also give us any questions from people who are online. So, open floor. Who would like to open our conversation today? Thank you, Alvin.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks to Ubumbano for the type of solidarity approach it has. It has assisted many struggles in a small but profound way, and that's from activists I work with. But just to be short, I think in '64 during his election campaign, Nixon said we give aid not to help others, but to help ourselves. And when we go through a period of '88, and Graham and Alan know about this. I was at Diaconia, I was a projects officer, and it was a conduit for funding for the struggle. So solidarity reset the agenda. We come to the current context where 1% controls 50% of the wealth in the world, and funding and development is formatted, broadly speaking. It's formatted, it's controlled, etc. And I think what's important, and as a contribution, is we do political economy analysis of how neoliberalism has unfolded, but we have not done the parallel historical analysis of how aid has changed post-Vietnam. How, for example, Harvard University has been the fifth column of imperialism to control and to contest anything that challenges neoliberalism. And you're going to look at funding in the Eastern Europe and the role that is played. So I think if we do that historical analysis on how aid has changed and how it's controlled, then we can be in a position, and this is for the funders to say, yes, we are part of challenging that order of the 1 to 50%, or we are part of reforming it and maintaining it. Because the point is that we're all part of this because we get funding that's formatted. You've got to have input, output, log frames, results-based, and it's kissing cousin, results-based management. Nothing about context at times, and context at various levels, including community terrain. Nothing about strategy, nothing about praxis, it's about deliverables. And I think basically what I'm saying, there needs to be an historical analysis of how funding has shifted as the world has changed, and how funding through the foundations and through the ideological work done by imperialism, mainly through the Center for International Affairs at Harvard University, which is actually the fifth column of American military, the ideological component. And how it's pulled us along. And if we don't have that historical analysis, we are not able to see the extent to which we are complacent or complicit in upholding the system. And the discourse of language, I mean, talk about beneficiaries, talk about outcomes, talk about intended and unintended consequences or outcomes. Is it an intended or unintended consequence that 23 activists from our Australia have been killed, or is it the nature of the state? That blocks your analysis immediately. So I just said the historical is a contribution, the historical is important.
Thank you.
Well, I also wanted to bring out an issue of continuing to raise agency, especially within communities, towards policy formulation. Because like when Graham was speaking, he brought out an issue about dignity. And usually I notice that the issue of dignity even begins with within our nations where we come from. I want to give an example. I'm from Zimbabwe. So I'm coming from Timanimani. We've experienced disasters. And usually in disaster situations, we've experienced an issue of militarization of aid. So the issue of militarization of aid comes within like our disaster response policies. It was built from the Civil Protection Unit, which put like the military to be the ones who are there to bring order. But now the question of order is now being questioned, because I remember when during the cyclone, then when food was being issued out, people would just throw the food. Then it would be like the strong people, usually the males, who would benefit from the aid. Then you'd find that women, as well as the elderly and those with disability, would then not really get the aid. But then in terms of numbers, they could say, well, we've distributed this much, but then did the aid reach the people? It did not. So I think the issue of building agency towards policy formulation is something that we also need to work on.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers and the inputs from the panelists. So I want to make two observations. The first one is in relation to the philanthropic community. I think because of very little regulation in that sector, there tends to be very little accountability. So if I have a pot of money and it belongs to me, I can decide who I give it to and for what purpose, right? So we've seen, funding that's been put into programs with very little results. And you can't hold any of those philanthropic organizations accountable for that. We've also seen funding that's been withdrawn from very impactful programs for various reasons. So it's like, I think that the whole sector there's very little accountability because of the way that it is structured, and I think we need to be having a conversation about what kind of regulation, a framework needs to be put in place, so that there's a lot more accountability for what they fund and how they fund it, etc. And I mean, I'm speaking from a very interesting position because we are a fund, but we are an intermediary grant maker. So in many ways, we are the filling, between the sandwich, because if upstream our funders regard us as beneficiaries, and downstream our beneficiaries regard us as a funder. So it's a very complex relationship, but I think you have the benefit of actually experiencing both, and I think it does give you a bit of insights into your own blind spots sometimes. The second issue I want to speaks to the people we call beneficiaries of funding, so the organizations that get funded through various pots of money. I think there's very little, perhaps let me say, not enough solidarity amongst those organizations, because I think what enables funders and philanthropic organizations they hold the power they have, because in many ways there isn't enough solidarity and collaboration amongst ourselves. So it's very easy to employ that divide and rule. I mean, we saw there in the pictures that were presented earlier how the funding becomes competitive, and once it becomes competitive, it's about whose problem is more important than the other, and we kind of stacked against each other, and it creates this very unhealthy competition, when in actual fact all these all these solutions are as important to the communities. So I'm just wondering to what extent we can foster a lot more solidarity, because that is what is going to give us the power to push back a lot more.
Thank you. Mine is not a question, but just a comment in terms of the politics of spaces. I was just thinking as well as Graham was talking in terms of how we have tried to pull communities to spaces we call high level, create for them dialogues with policymakers and the like. And I'm just thinking, I think that is one issue we need to address. I believe that at community level, there are different spaces that communities themselves have and make use of in terms of diffusing power, in terms of giving each other solidarity, in terms of resolving their own issues and challenges, conflicts, whatever, you name it, even developmental issues. I believe there are community spaces that provide such kind of platforms. So this politics of the spaces that we prepare ourselves and we say we are organizing communities or we are organizing activists, taking them away and without really appreciating that they already have existing spaces that they are comfortable in. I think is one shortfall that we have that I think we need to address. We need to explore more of those kind of spaces that are already existing. I know that communities organize already in different ways. Women organize, youths organize, churches, you name it. I think there are different forms of spaces that are at community level that can actually challenge power, and we haven't explored those. We want to continue fixated in our own kind of platforms that we believe give us the deliverables that we would have written in our proposals.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions from online? If you can.
Okay, so Sikhole Benson says, donors and philanthropists are not very different from private investors in their behavior. For-profit organizations have to mold themselves around delivering value to their shareholders. Do not-for-profit companies ever assess themselves in terms of the value they generate, social, political, and economic capital-based measurements instead of measuring non-tangible factors? Should I repeat that? And the next one is from Matthias. He says, is it not our responsibility as CSOs, NGOs, to create a bridge between the institutional donors and philanthropists and the communities? The donors come with their needs and expectations. The communities come with their needs and expectations. We as NGOs have to understand the needs and expectations of investors and we respond to these needs and expectations, but we don't replicate the same conditions to the communities. Rather, we listen to the communities and rights holders and we develop mechanisms so that we can respond to them. In short, it is our duty as NGOs to balance these power relations. And he says, I want to ask what concretely the speakers mean when they say we must challenge these power imbalances in philanthropy. When we want to build a house and we go to a bank and to get credit, we can't go there and challenge the bank and say we do not like your credit conditions. So I just want to know what specifically we should do to quote unquote challenge. And then there's a comment to Matthias.
Okay. Yes, that's on the screen. Is that the last one?
Yes. The last one is the comment to the previous one I just said.
Do you want to read it out?
Which says, you are, so Innocent responds saying, you are right in a sense, yet there is no one size fits all to it. NGOs and CSOs must try and create these bridges and often also may be culpable of simply extending conditionality to the same communities instead imposed by funders or philanthropists.
But I guess what is key is to shape the power relations among the communities, CSOs, and funders so that development projects are informed more from the needs and operational context of the communities they serve. In my view, conditions of funding and resource allocation must be flexible and also consider the community's operational context and be relevant rather than extended uniformly.
Thank you. Some interesting stuff there. It's glad I moderate. So maybe I just want the panel to reflect on this question of power. We have a view that almost we need to counterbalance donor power through a solidarity network of organizations seeking funding. So counterbalance it by working on the side where we create solidarity networks that can agree or reject funding and maybe in that way shift the way donors behave. An interesting sort of notion of maybe working with this idea that it's the weakness of community that we have to experience, and instead of community going to the high level spaces as we call them, is should decision makers not be coming to community and using the processes of community, the processes that are already embedded in those spaces to resolve, to think through, to fix. So before we talk about the other bit, which I think is really interesting, some reflections on this notion of power and balancing power and what opportunities there might be for people who are practicing in the philanthropic space to deal with that, which probably is a direct response to the question that we had. Who would like to go?
Okay, so I'll jump in a bit. Alan, we talked about organizations, and I want to push back on that. Because civic space is not just organizations, and that's a big part of our fundamental problem, is that we want professionalized entities who can manage our resources.
And that's not a mic, that's just
Sorry.
for the recording.
We want professionalized entities who can manage our resources in specific ways. And so we want to fund those who look like forms that we can recognize, and they're in our own mold, they're hierarchical. So we then want to take away trust-based networks and trust-based systems of organizing and replace them with hierarchical networks. And then we want to impose a system of reporting to us. And in doing so, we fundamentally destroy the trust system that makes them work in the first place. Right? So I think when we talk about what's an alternative practice, we have to go beyond organizations. We have to talk about what does the broader civic space look like. And it's easy, we jump on the bandwagon, we've gone from INGOs to movements, and now everybody's talking about movements, but movements aren't just the only civic space. And there's so many other different fora that happen before you get a movement, right? So they don't appear out of nowhere. There are people doing work on the ground all the time, and often it's the same leaders who are doing that work. And then they culminate and they organize, and after many, many years, you'll get a movement. But we think that, okay, we can jump on a movement bandwagon and all of a sudden, we're diversifying our civic space, and that's not it. We have to really think about what does civic space mean much more differently. And then at first we talked about this high level thing, right? So, every time Davos happens, we get so excited when somebody from our sector goes to present at Davos, and we think that that's going to make a difference. And so we started from saying, well, we want a seat at the table. First we want to be in the room, then we want a seat at the table, then we want to build different tables, but actually the house is crumbling. We need to think about what does a new house look like? What is the new structure that's based on our narratives and our understanding of what change means look like? And I think we'll have to start shifting where we're putting our resources and how to build that space for organized power to emerge from the bottom. It's not that they don't have power, but that we act in ways that stifles that power. And I think that's something we have to think about.
Exactly. Okay, Ellen, so I want to speak on the notion of money being put in, but the results not showing, right? And this is on a community level. So we have organizations and movements and spaces because there's an issue that exists that we know, we've identified there's an issue, and we find ways of addressing those issues, right? And there's almost like a process. So you have this issue, you know these people need 1, 2, and 3 and all of that. Then we go, we need the money to do all of that. We know there's this issue, but we need the money. So then the process starts. So you then seek out funding, right? You're trying to put together a proposal to explain what it is that you want to do and how you will do it, right? And then you send it out. Someone says, okay, I like your work, it aligns with the work that I'm doing, I can give you funding. You take that money, you go into the work, right? You do the work. Now here are 2 things, right? One, I have to then report in this set criteria by my funder. Things change. Organizing changes all the time. We started out with workshops and all of these things, and then things change gradually. Then there are different demands from the community. Same issue, but the organizing and mobilizing all of that and the work actually is different. But then the reporting criteria is still the same. So I have to then almost take everything that I was doing, all the work that I was doing, and put it into the set structure, right? And meet the set outcomes, okay? That you might have met, but not necessarily in the way that you were given or being told, right? And then that's the first thing, right? And there's no communication about that. There's no communication about, okay, what happens if there is impact, but then it's in this way? How do I then, report on it in a way that the funder is happy, they see that their money was used in the way they wanted, but also I've made impact, right? So that's the first one. And then the second one, like it was mentioned, that you get people, okay, fine, there's this issue, there's a natural disaster, right? People are being given out parcels. Unfortunately, only a certain group is able to get that because of how everything was administered. How do I then go back and report that, yes, we're able to reach 1,500 people, however, this and that happened, without me then jeopardizing losing that funding? So somehow, I think with the work that is done on the ground and what is expected in reporting and results and outcomes, that's where then it becomes a situation of, there's a gap almost in between, because then we now have to shape the work in a way that it'll give us opportunities to get that kind of support and to continue getting that support, because results need to show. But then the results are not necessarily in the structure or manner that is expected, but the results are there. People got, that they benefited from all of that, however, not in the way that they're structured and said. So things are evolving, the work changes. There's constant evolving. How do we then make sure that all of these things align? Our organizing and mobilizing and the demands on the ground align with everything else, right? The funding and all of that, and the reporting, the monitoring, the evaluation, all of that, that everything aligns, creating a gap in that. I think that's where the challenge is.
A couple of comments, I mean, certainly not answers, but just some reflections around. I think sometimes we find the word solidarity quite convenient, because solidarity begins to talk about being together, about collaboration, and when we are being together, then it allows us to maintain our control and power. We're no longer just doing it on our own, we're doing it with others. And we talk about that as solidarity. And for me, it's a very diluted form of solidarity. And I think someone mentioned here the word politics. And I wonder if we shouldn't be just bringing the word politics back into our discussion a bit more. Politics is about power, it's about choices. And talking about the politics of solidarity. Solidarity is not a nice fuzzy thing, being together, and therefore we're in solidarity. That kind of being together just masks relations of power and allows those with power to continue to exercise our power in the name of others. And it becomes a politics of representation rather than a politics of articulating the dehumanization that is taking place. So some movements, some formations talk about those who suffer it must lead it. Those who suffer the injustice, those who suffer the dehumanization, are the professors of their own suffering. They have the knowledge, they have the experience, they have the insight, and they're carrying the risk of choices around it. And they're the ones who need to lead actions of solidarity. I think we in the NGO world feel we know best. And we complain about funders and imposing their agenda. But the way we practice, we invariably silence those who are suffering it. And we don't allow those who suffer it to lead it. We invite them to our events and to our marches and to our campaigns. And we provide them with our free t-shirts. But we are not making the choice to follow their leadership. We are not making the choice to be shaped by that thinking that emerges out of that sharp end of the struggle that people are leading. And solidarity then becomes the comfortable term of we're in it together. I think solidarity needs to reclaim some of its sharpness. It's about being chosen to be led by those who suffer it. And we will then be present and allow that campaign, that call for action, to shape our action. And it might well be that t-shirts are not what is needed. It might be that something else is needed, and that resources be put differently. So I just caution about solidarity networks when they become what it actually is collaboration amongst NGOs looking after their own interests, which further silences those who are directly impacted. And so I want to bring it back to, I really like the way Halima was talking about the sense of, it's not just about organizations, it's about the civic space. And I want to bring again the word of politics into that civic space. It is the nature of politics taking place within that civic space. Who speaks, who thinks, who articulates is absolutely critical. And I think we've got too used to collapsing our civic space down to NGOs. And we're not naming the politics that's functioning within that further silences and dehumanizes. And I come back to Paulo Freire's phrasing of the weakness of the weakness of the oppressed, their power. And I find that a very uncomfortable term, because I don't like that phrasing of the weakness of the oppressed, because it seems to perpetuate that sense of being marginalized and their weakness. And I find it very difficult to work with that when Freire talks about it. But there's something within that if we do fundamentally believe that the only power sufficient to free both the oppressed and the oppressor emerges from the oppressed themselves, then surely what we do, if it's not shaped by that, is getting in the way of that. I mean, if the only power that can free us all emerges from the articulations and practice and thinking of the oppressed themselves, who open that space, then surely solidarity requires us to very quickly get alongside that, learn from that, critique it, engage it, and be shaped by it. Otherwise, if we're not, we're getting in the way of that potential power to free us all. And I think too often we make our discussions about us and about our power, and not the choices that need to be made to strengthen the power of those who are suffering it and leading it and articulating a new vision. And I think that needs to disrupt our practice quite significantly.
Thank you, Ben. I just see a comment there by our old friend Gerhard from Christian Aid.
The quote-unquote false generosity term is a powerful description and critique of the donor environment and development sector. Any suggestions what should and could be concrete role or next steps of international NGOs to counteract some of this false generosity? How can, I believe you wanted to say NGOs. INGOs, okay. How can INGOs and national and local actors really complement each other on this journey to change, and how can we counteract power differentials of often vast, complex institutions? And there's another comment from Innocent Isaac. He says, another big part of philanthropy or NGO relationship that dovetails into this conversation is research and knowledge inquiry in Africa, which invariably involves different levels of relationships between global North and global South partners, including funding streams that reflect donor ideological priorities about the development in Africa. This also needs to redress power asymmetries in order to prioritize development directions set by those in Africa. This would promote equitable solidarity in development, inquiry, and knowledge generation.
So I want to shift the conversation a bit, just because I think we're drifting back into this space of rhetorical conversation. We're talking about the problem, we're describing it, we're re-describing it, we're painting it in nice colors. There has been a moment for the last 3 years where we saw something different. In conversations over the last few months, somebody remarked on it as, during COVID, we saw a return of kindness in the way we work. Somebody else noted in another piece of work that I'm doing, during COVID, we found our humanity again. And the comments were, and the conversations were, so what has changed during this time of COVID? It was stressful. We were really having a difficult time. And the expectation was people were going to be telling us about how hard it was. Instead, in this moment, in one of the darkest moments this planet has ever seen, we found our humanity and we found kindness again. And interestingly enough, those were reflected in the way donors behaved, in the way we all behaved. We stopped worrying about whether the money was going to be stolen. We stopped worrying about whether the forms were going to be filled in or whether the report was on time. And we said to people, do what you need to in order for us to survive this pandemic. We found a different way. We didn't rediscover it. It's always been there. But the excuse before COVID was, well, our systems won't allow us to do that. Our back donors have restrictions on the grants. And yet, all of a sudden, in this moment of solidarity, when we all realize that we sink or swim together, when our humanity was tied to every human being on the planet who could have become infected with COVID, we behaved in a completely different way. We said that we will trust others to pull all of us out of the problem. And now we're having conversations again about a return to compliance. We are writing the reports again. We are filling in the log frames. We are creating the conditions of a world that we stepped out of for 3 years. We are recreating a world that we stepped out of for 3 years. That's our starting point. We did something fundamentally different as a sector for 3 years. Why must we go back? So for me, that for me is we've reached a crucial point in this journey as a sector, is that we've realized that behaving in a slightly different way by building up the trust-based relationships, that we can actually confront a huge global problem. What is stopping us, not just the philanthropic community, what is stopping all of us from reinforcing those trust relationships that were built by scrapping the log frames and saying to people, do what you need to get us through this? What is holding us back now? That's the starting point for any philanthropy. We have it already. And so my question is to everybody is, how do we build on what we have already? How do we not step the 2 steps back? What are the things that we must defend, that we must grow, and we must protect? Yes.
I want to reflect on what you said about the time when we had COVID. I think during that time, people actually started thinking as a person within an institution and not an institution. Because when you start thinking as a person, then you really feel what other people are feeling. But when you're in an institution, you start looking at the whole thing and how you can move things through an institution. But during COVID, people were just humanizing everything and actually moving like that. And I think when we really humanize what other people are feeling, then we actually go through what they're feeling too, and we do it together. But when we're thinking as something that has to move, an institution is very big, and when you start thinking about how the board moves and everything moves, then you stop thinking about the people and you start thinking about the institution. And then I think on how we can move back to on how we're behaving during COVID, it's about removing all the institutional things, all the things that I think hold the power, and coming together as friends, coming together as one people, and not really as divided entities, and thinking through everything together. Because when we listen to each other as friends, when we don't have any hierarchy or anything that is controlling us, we actually hear each other out. But if we're thinking that we are donors, and these are beneficiaries, this is the intermediary, then we forget about what people are actually feeling and what we want to achieve. But if we come together as friends with no limits and actually listen to each other, then we can actually come up with something that is very great.
I do want to ask a question. I mean, the example of COVID that you give is quite instructive. But the question we should also be asking is, did we get value for the investment? And I mean, I keep going back to this word accountability because I think it's so important. Yes, we can discuss different forms of accountability which are not log frames, but we must agree on some accountability framework, you know? Because, and again, borrowing from your COVID example, we saw how a lot of money went into food parcel. And in the end, it was a logistics business because 60% actually went into transporting the food parcels from point A to point B, and only 40% went to the actual, foodstuffs. Now, where's the accountability there? You know, we put money and we said we're going to trust you to do what needs to be done, but there's got to be some framework, and it doesn't have to be a log framework, but there's got to be some way we then hold each other accountable, whether it's the funders or the recipients of the grants or the people on the ground, the activists. There's got to be some way we all hold each other accountable, and I think for me that should be the focus of the conversation. What is an appropriate, acceptable, and adequate framework for holding each other accountable?
I'm shaking now when you talk. I just want to completely agree with you because I think that there are this, I loved you bringing us back to the here and now, because I do think a lot of the conversations up until now have been very much like big historical sweeping and so on, and actually to what extent is that going to really impact on our work? Now I must say up front that I'm not recently from the NGO world, although I have been, you can see I'm ancient. But one of the, behind every positive thing you're saying about what happened in COVID and the solidarity and the you know, the emotional side. Of course, we all know things went very wrong as well. And I think it boils down to exactly what you're saying. You know, if we can distinguish between responsibility and accountability, responsibility being assuming that our leaders are going to do the right thing, and accountability being the people saying, you know, what is the right thing, and you damn well do it because we've put you in that position, so pull it off. I think part of our issue is training. Sorry, I'm scared to use these words because I know that they're all politically incorrect, but in my day, like, the fact that training groups and so on should really be focusing on how do you respectfully hold people who are senior to you, older than you, different from you, or whatever it is. We have to equip people to be able to hold people to account. Because the problem with being in a society which is so desperately poor and needy is that even we're in empowering, I know that's also a problematic word or whatever, providing voice, putting, you know, giving a forum for people to talk. Even there is abuse of power within the community. And how do we make sure that we are not fueling that or enabling that? And I think it's a serious problem if people who are not in the community sort of wash their hands. Oh, well, the community decided, when there is serious abuse. The example came from over there of food being put out in Zimbabwe, and the men get it first. To what extent are people on the outside of the community? You know, how do you, I want some advice, how do you deal with that situation? Because certainly in NGO situations I've dealt with, there has been abuse, deep abuse of the community members by other community members. And outsiders cannot just walk saying, it's your business, you know, you sort it out, you learn on the job. What is the way? Because ultimately it's about accountability and people crossing, and I'm saying this as somebody from a church background, cutting through the thing that you get in churches where leaders have come from, you know, they come from somewhere, and who am I to challenge them? We've got to cut through that and say, you've got to cut through that and talk and hold your priests to account, or hold whoever it is to account within cultural institutions, educational institutions, cultural institutions, families, education, wherever you look. People have got to learn how to say to somebody, oi, it's me that you serve. This is what we have agreed, you aren't doing it. Therefore, don't call yourself a leader. We've got to give people that voice and that skill and that confidence to be able to challenge, to respectfully challenge. And if I can just throw in a little bit, so I don't stick my head up later, the local version of Paulo Freire, which I think has influenced quite a few people here, was Anne Hope. Those who came across Anne Hope. Why is Anne Hope not right there? Because she did that, getting people together, and you talk, and you get people to say what are their needs. And I think, I mean, the word accountability wasn't a big thing in her day, and she's passed away, unfortunately, but now it is. You know, that could be a huge contribution that I think anybody outside the community, inside the community can do, is to bring people to really hold their leaders to account. And then if I can just advertise a book, and I swear I don't know the author, I don't know nothing. So I've got no shares in this damn story. But there's an amazing book that has arrived called Nation on the Couch. It was only published last year for the first time. It's by a guy from Cape Town University, I think, but he addresses, not from an NGO perspective or in the civil society space necessarily, but he is talking about power relations in the world. So if anybody's interested in reading, his name is, the author is Wabi Long. Anyway, he's from Cape Town, and it's very South African, and I'd like to recommend it. I really think it's an extraordinary read.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. So I just want to maybe reflect on the conversation around accountability, because for me, I think there is a recognition of the fact that within the NGO sector,
there are a lot of things that are not going right in terms of our practices and how we do solidarity, and there are problematic issues that arise from that. However, I think that we also need to be able to think through what we mean by accountability, because some of the accountability comes from actually listening to people who were, for instance, in the case of COVID, because this is what is in the conversation now, to listen to people who have received the support that has come from COVID. And that for me is what accountability looks like. It's engaging with people, not the accountability that is in papers and in numbers, but it's in the impact that will be communicated by people that we're talking about who would have been the recipients. It could be negative, it could be negative, it could be positive, but that's what for me is important. But what also I want to come to in terms of what Alan was saying in terms of the practice and the changes that happened with COVID is the fact that donors were able now to be flexible. There was a lot of flexibility. We experienced it in our organization. And I thought that was the level in which I was hearing Alan talking. The fact that the same supporters, donors, whatever, that we're talking about, that are putting all of these conditionalities into funding and going back on what was happening on COVID. They were able to be flexible. They were able to say, look, if you need to shift things, if people need to work from home because the offices, they cannot go to the office and so on, they were willing to accept that people should be able to do that. They were able to say, okay, we can, because you're not able to go into the community to do the programs that we had initially funded you for, you could be able to then change it depending on whether people want food, people are wanting to be supported with going to the hospital, whatever. But they were able to just say, fine, do whatever needs to be done. And organizations were able to do that. And so what I'm hearing is the fact that why are we not able to have that level of flexibility? I mean, obviously, COVID is not present anymore, but then that flexibility, that shows us that it's possible to be flexible. So why are we going back on that and not being able to be flexible the way that we're able to be flexible with COVID? And so for me, that is where the conversation needs to be. And maybe the one thing, the last thing that I want to comment on is the fact that we need to maybe also explore. I mean, I understand that we have a few philanthropic organizations that are among us, and maybe that agree with what we are talking about. And I think from a level of engaging, there's a start, and it's been going on within Ubumbano, the conversation, this kind of conversation. And so I think we need to find a way of bringing other funders into this conversation and to challenge their own practices as well, because there's only a few that are amongst us and maybe that are agreeable with us, but we don't have as many that are out there. And so also to challenge ourselves as NGOs, because we are problematic in these power relations that we're talking about, especially in how we deal with the communities that we are serving. We are problematic because exactly what we are complaining about when it comes to funders, we are doing it to communities that we're working with. And so we should be able to also look at ourselves and question our own practices as well.
I've been holding back because there's just so much richness here to kind of absorb, and my mind has been going all over the place, so I just really appreciate the space and the conversation. But I also really appreciate the way you brought us back, Alan, to saying how do we shift from what we know to doing something, the action. And I think one of the things for me that emerged during COVID was seeing how many of the restrictions that either community activists or us as NGOs that we perceive to be in place from those who we perceive to have power are actually not. They're self-imposed limits. So yes, a lot of funders reached out and said, how can we support? How would you like to change? What else do you need to do differently during COVID? But there was nothing there, got nothing. There were many things there that we could have done anyway. That there was no, they weren't telling us not to work from home. They weren't telling us not to work flexibly or give communities data and airtime in a different way so that they could mobilize locally without NGOs having to be there. So I feel like there's a lot that in COVID helped us see that a lot of these limitations are self-imposed, and we can lift that and we can continue to take the positives that we learned, and it doesn't even need a negotiation, it just needs us to see things differently and articulate them differently. I also think, again, it's so easy to see the problems. It's so easy to say, we do this wrong, we do that wrong, we do that wrong. But it's the concreteness of solutions that I feel is so often missing, and that's what, I felt that this space is trying to get to. But, we talk about, not log frames, let's find other ways to apply for funding to hold each other accountable. There are millions of creative and amazing ways that organizations, communities, donors have been testing for decades. Is it, whether you're talking about, stories of change rather than outputs and objectives. It's been around, it's been experimented with. Many donors have very creative ways of enabling us to express change. But what are we asking for? Because asking for change, saying, I don't like that, please give me something different, doesn't give us or those we're engaging with the power to say, this is what I want, or here's an alternative, because it's so much easier to articulate what we don't like than what we actually want. And I think that's so often when we never get to saying, we don't want this, we're doing this wrong, we don't want this. What do you want? I mean, you can hear in the conversation, organizations, funders are saying what within limitations, obviously, but at a systems level as well as at a practical level, what is it that we're asking for that's different from ourselves and from those around us? But I think the most practical thing I took away from today actually was humility and hospitality. So thank you for those principles that I think when you apply them practically give us a lot of answers. I feel so inspired. But just to wrap up, one last thing I think is about thinking about our own spheres of influence. So where are the different spaces in which we have influence in our lives, personally, professionally, and what can we take from this conversation? And I have to narrow it down. But, what is it that can help us go deeper, look at the small and the practical and the pragmatic and what can we change? But it comes back to this bigger question of how are the small things that we do and change impacting on something bigger? What's the bigger vision of what we're trying to change? Because fiddling with the small bits, reporting differently, is that really changing dynamics? Is it really changing power? Is it really giving voice? Or are we just doing the same things in nicer ways?
So what I'd like to do, Halima, I don't want you to
different way of being and a different way of doing. There's a value space there that that informs how we work. There's a value space that challenges our existing dominant systems and structures in the philanthropic sector. And if we start to say, well, okay, we will continue with our dominant way of working, and then take a small experiment which takes, $1 million here and $1 million there, and we have 500 million still being programmed on the dominant way, then is that really aligning with a values transformation? Is it really about what we're talking about, what is solidarity in practice? I saw a term a couple of weeks ago which talked about performative philanthropy. And it really made me stop, and I went to go look it up. What actually do they mean? And they talked about how we're saying the right things, but when we interrogate in practice, we're doing things, we're tweaking at the margins, we're saying, okay, we've set up this collaborative fund, we've supported that participatory fund, but the existing system, the broader narrative of how change happens, is not shifting because it's a tiny bit here and a tiny bit there. So either we commit or we be honest and say, look, our system cannot work this way. Our institution cannot work this way. We don't have the political will to work this way. But it's suicide to say so, right? So then we do performative philanthropy. And we say, yes, look, we're doing great things. But I'm sorry, those small experiments are not enough. And then the second part of these experiments is that we have an idea, our idea of what change looks like. And then we say we're gonna give you $1 million to build the evidence of what a different way of working looks like. And we assess it based on our existing ideas of what is change and our existing ideas of what is impact. Not on an iterative basis of let's see what happens and let's ask them to figure out what does progress look like. Is this working or is it not? So we still bring it back. We bring it back to ourselves on how we center what needs to happen. And so I think the time for experimentation is over. I think we have to do and we have to do it. And I feel really, really strongly about this. What does civil society want? People have been talking a lot about what they want. The work I did is not new. If you talk to people on the ground, they're saying we want to engage in ways that we have control over the direction that our lives take. They're saying that we want to make the decisions, right? And the ways in which we as philanthropy has been working has been curtailing that space, if we're really honest about it. So they're saying we want to have relationships of dignity. They're saying we're not counter or anti-funding. We're not counter or anti-accountability. But the ways in which you are framing accountability is deeply problematic. And the kinds of things you're framing accountability on, the things you're seeing as relevant, is deeply problematic. Because you're not asking us what we value. You're not asking us how we see change. You're not asking about relationships and about substance. You're asking about people and about numbers. And you're thinking about scale in very, very different ways. Speaking to movements, they were saying, we want space to be able to think and to be able to reflect, right? We're constantly on the spectrum. We're constantly having to work. But when are you investing in us to be able to do the work? At a discussion not long ago, an activist from Madagascar talked about how we romanticize movement leaders and how they're put up there on the pedestal, and then we expect that they have to be these perfect people. But life happens, and they have multiple identities, but we only see them as a movement leader, and so we only support the movement work. We only support them. We instrumentalize them to feed our aims. We're not supporting them as people with multiple identities. We're not supporting them as activists, as mothers. We're not supporting them as sisters, as brothers, as community members. What does it mean to support people in the ways in which their lives are lived, rather than in the ways in which they feed into our agendas? So I think, I'll stop there. There's many other things that they were saying, but I think I'll open up this space.
Thank you. Maybe before we move on, maybe just to reflect on this notion of accountability. And Laurel, you're working in the agroecology space, right? And one of the things that the agroecology space
exploring is participatory guarantee systems, right? Which are a fundamentally different form of accountability. Can you maybe talk about that a little bit,
Probably not the best person to talk about it. It's all very new for me. Because we've only really, thanks to COVID, moved into this space. So there's probably others, maybe you can talk a bit more about it. But so yeah, I don't think I'd articulate very well, Ellen. But I think even the fact that we're moving into those conversations and spaces and thinking outside, entirely outside of the normal work we do, and saying we have to keep doing that and learning completely new concepts, comes out of the kindness and the dignity and the other things that emerged during COVID. But I'm going to ask you to talk about it, because as I said, for me, it's been a massive learning curve. It's a very different sphere to the work that we were doing, and I haven't got the right language yet.
I was avoiding it.
Sorry.
So essentially, participatory guarantee systems are based on the premise that if you're producing in a community, the quality of your produce, your practices are validated by that community because they see you every day. They see what you do. They see what you're putting into the fields. Your neighbors can see you. Everybody around you can see you. When you deliver a food parcel, we know it's getting to you as the individual in that community. So the system assumes that the guarantee comes from your accountability to the people in your space. It doesn't assume another level of compliance that says we need to send an inspector in to come validate that you are farming organically or you're farming in this and this and this way. It is built on a process that says we, as members of any other community, hold ourselves and each other accountable to the person next to me. And that's a fundamental shift in the way we think about accountability, which is usually compliance focused, which is usually quite easy to get if you can pay somebody for it. Like all of the organizations that are giving you really great audit statements are paying for those audit statements, and you'll find out 10 years down the line that they were stealing the money anyway. Right? That's the truth of it. So how do we move to a more trust-based approach to accountability and compliance, rather than what we see now is very much a certification-based process that is as far away from human as you can possibly imagine. It's tick the boxes, sign it off by a professional, and you do okay after that. The grandest example of this in this country at the moment, world-renowned management companies, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Bain, McKinsey, have defrauded this country at the level that we can't even imagine, operating within the confines of the law. And they were compliant. They're not accountable. And so we need to be starting to think about accountability as trust between people rather than as being able to fill out the forms. And I think that is one massive thing for the donor community to realize, is that you're being defrauded on a day-to-day basis, even though your forms are full. Accepted. Sorry,
within the rules.
Yes, then I'll.
Me first?
Yes.
Gosh, I forgot what I was going to say. I was listening to everyone, but let me just get my train of thought. You know, I think we all come from different realities. And how we read our reality is so important. I'm not sure how I'm reading my reality right now. To be quite honest, there's a lot of things, you know, that you said, that everyone said, that makes you think so much. And like the lady said, her head is spinning. Hopefully my head is not spinning, because I kept thinking of one,
You know, recently one incident in KwaZulu-Natal, well, not one incident, it was the floods. And that made a lot of news. Now, I kept thinking about something I heard recently, is that there's no water, there's no, the normal things that we hear, the reality that's on the ground. But something that happened recently is that some communities decided, with or without money, with or without funding, they were going to get those pipes going so that they can get water. And I was thinking, yeah, this is the first time in maybe about 20 years or whatever, 200 years, that we're seeing this kind of devastation, and that we're seeing what's happening with communities. They obviously read the reality and said, look, we cannot wait for active Ubumbano. Sorry, actually. We cannot wait for gift of the givers, although gift of the givers did jump in. But I was thinking really now, as I'm sitting here, what if there's absolutely no money? What if there's no funding coming from wherever? Look what's happening in Ukraine. Anyway, we're not going to talk politics, but it really made me think. As I'm sitting here, in fact, I was supposed to leave at 4 o'clock, but this is very, very interesting. And I want to thank all, whether they're donors or funders or whether I'm a beneficiary or whichever where I'm sitting right now, you know. I think this is really a conversation that made me think. It's very meaningful. So thank you. And I'm so sorry, but I have to leave now. I have to. I'm already quite late.
It's being recorded, so you'll see the rest.
Okay, so you do now
so
Bahai. So I was talking here today with both hats, okay, as a community development nurse and also as a faith-based person. I'm sorry.
Abdia has been part of the active Ubumbano journey for a very long time.
Yeah,
and she comes completely on her own terms. She's really full of nonsense, but she's lovely to have her. She never ever compromises on the nature of her involvement. So
thank you, everyone. It's really opened my mind.
Yeah, I think in terms of possibilities of the way forward, I think when you were speaking about your results that you need to report, I think a fundamental issue is we need to reclaim our planning and learning sovereignty. And therefore, our discourse of language needs to be different. We need to draw on Freire and emancipatory praxis, etc. So we control those frames, they don't control us. So indicators are static at the point of planning. But indicators of your progress are happening all the time. And therefore, we have a structural situation with funders. It's a structural problem. And therefore, how we deal with structural problems is cracks in the wall. Okay? And they're not going to change. And again, I'll repeat, there's politics to that. There's an ideology to it. It's about maintaining and controlling the power in the world. And we've got to realize that those log frames and those ZOP and results-based management is ideological. So I think ACT is very special in that it's got both solidarity funding partners who see the importance of this change, but are caught up in the structure. And I think in the evaluation report, Ashley, we picked this up. It's critical that we use the critical mass of the collective wisdom to go over there and say, you need our help. You need our help. And to sharpen those contradictions and to make sure that they begin to change. Otherwise, we'll come back here and talk the same thing a few years down the line. And I think ACT has got that access, it's got that influence, it's got that it's got that influence, it's got the credibility. It can begin to convene those spaces in Europe with the partners. Because if they are committed to the Copenhagen principles, then they need to demonstrate that change.
I'd like to ask two reflections from the museum for Graham. Yes, it was noted in
Abdia's input that communities are doing stuff with or without money, right? And Ulibo is an example of an organization that started doing something before there was money. Can you talk a little bit about that? And going also, if we can then reflect on what if there were no donors? What would be happening in the world?
Okay. Yeah, that's important. So I'd like to believe that's literally where it all begins. You identifying that issue as a community leader, community organizer, whatever the politically correct term for it is. But then there comes a point where, in business terms, demand exceeds supply, right? So you started out with a small group, you didn't have any money, but you were able to, organize and, put one and one together. But then demand then exceeds that. I then learned that Halima's doing this work, and I know I'm in need with 10 other people, and then I'm going to Halima. Halima already has their own 20. I'm adding my 10 plus me. Then you find that supply then cannot really meet the demand. That's when it then extends to having to seek out funding and all of that. Again, it goes back to accountability. As that community organizer or leader, how do I then make sure that the people are getting from whatever I am receiving, right? But I absolutely agree that it really should be, it should also be us taking action on our own for whatever issue that we feel needs to be addressed, but then we get to a point where demand really exceeds supply and we seek out help. So two things: accountability from the people who are organizing, the communities who are getting these resources of funding and all of that, and actually giving them to the community. And then there's also the dignity, the whole notion of dignity. If I am getting 50,000 rand to assist with that, let's say administering ARVs or sanitary pads or whatever, right? Now I need to have some kind of proof that I gave it to 100 people, right? But now here I am with my phone taking pictures, videos. That's, dignity, right? So in majority of the time, the measurements or criteria that we are given for the community, you end up having people who are like, I'm not going to go to Limo. Others was fought, so I don't want people to see my vulnerability, my need, my state. Here I am in a shack. I don't have access to water or electricity. There's 10 of us here. I come in. No, I'll assist. Here I am capturing. It's a challenge. But in terms of starting without money, majority of the time it's when there are too many people to assist and very little to offer them. It becomes an issue.
Thank you. Okay. What if there were no NGOs?
What if there are no NGOs? You just changed the question.
They're just forms of the same thing. So if we cut out the intermediary professional layer, would our communities die?
Oh no. I think we'll be better off.
That's an interesting question because, exactly. We assume that change happens because NGOs are there and because funders are there. And we assume therefore that's how change happens. And we've developed a whole model of how to bring about change, and we professionalize it and make it happen. It's a lack of imagination, I'm afraid. Some of the reality is, I talk about experience with Abashlali, Basim Jondo. Abashlali articulates themselves as, I think they describe themselves as one of the biggest social movements in democratic South Africa. I think it emerged without a funder, it emerged without an NGO, it emerged without a strategic plan, it emerged without a log frame. It emerged because people said, we've had enough. We've had enough. And our life demands that we act and make ourselves known, and we refuse to take the place that the state has assigned us to. I think history tells us all movements of the world have started without NGOs. They've started in spite of professionals, and they've started without money. Act Ubumbano as an initiative started because funders said, we need to leave this country. So this very space that we have here, talking about philanthropy, began when the funding organisation said, we can no longer be present. Sorry, the money's going. And people, organisations from Southern Africa said, the relationship is not dependent on money. The relationship is about the name, Ubumbano, solidarity. That's the shape of who we are. So it's not talking in abstract what could happen or what would happen if there's no funders or no organisations. It's what has happened when there haven't been those things present. And what have been the responses when there's been this sense of you're touching me on a very sensitive spot when you say, I cannot be in relationship with you because there's no money. Since when is my relationship with you depend on money? If it is, then we've got the wrong sort of relationship. And when you touch a human being on a very sensitive point, it erupts. Our humanity comes. I had some comments earlier on. I wanted to put some labels to what I heard you say about an egalitarian politics, an egalitarian practice. Is when we suddenly discover our common humanity, it opens up the space and the possibility for the rest of us to act in a humane way and to discover ways to be free amongst ourselves. And I think we confine the professionalizing of change way too much. And I think that's trying to shift, maybe I was trying to find that word, shifting the ground away from professionalizing and power and control to rather looking at the eruptions that take place as places that give us hope. I was also going to comment, Ellen, you got me talking about this notion of accountability. And somewhere in our conversation is the assumption that those who have money, they know that people we give money don't want to account for it. There's an assumption there somewhere. And so a lot of our discussion was they don't want to account. And that's the problem. And we then technicize accountability. I'm a theologian, and so we have this discussion around there's a verse in Scripture that says, be prepared at all times to give an account for the faith that lives within you. And this notion of accountability is being prepared at all times to articulate, to give an account for the faith, the practice, the belief that lives within you. And that's accountability first and foremost, is to be able to name who we are, to name our practice, to name how we see the world, and name how we position ourselves in the world to change the world. Be prepared at all times. And that's both for us as NGOs, for funders, for community activists. That's a different kind of practice that emerges. And it's a very strongly democratic practice that says everybody matters, everybody thinks. And because of that, be prepared at all times to give an account for our practice. Because our accountability, we can be held accountable to the values of our practice and to our practice itself. The technical side of accounting for the rands and cents and the euros and the pounds, that's a given. That's a given. If there's any honesty, integrity amongst us, our democratic practice cannot allow anybody to run gently with money. You know, it's a given. We're honest about how we receive and spend money. And then funders should be just as honest about it. And community activists should be just as honest about it. And just as honest when you say, we actually don't know, we think we messed up. Can you help us work out what went wrong? We certainly know no one stole it, but we can't account quite for the last few cents. Can you help us out here? because that accounting is the technical part that goes alongside the more democratic practice of we belong to each other. We're accountable to each other, and we're accountable for our values and our practice. And that gets creative then, because then we find our common humanity, and it opens up all sorts of spaces for acting together. And I think some of the questions around, so tell us, what should we do then? I'm sorry if this offends anyone, but can I put it bluntly? It's a cop-out. It's a cop-out. I'm not going to tell you what to do. Take responsibility for your own action. But I quite like some of the way Halima articulated, saying what she heard was people saying, we want relationships of dignity. We want relationships of respect and trust. So if you want to know what to do, engage. Speak. Have the open discussion to say, how can we make this relationship a relationship of dignity and respect? For myself as the outsider to that relationship, I can't tell you the technical things to do. Let that emerge in that conversation and see what requirements come out of you and of each other. Allow that to emerge in an honest, frank engagement of respect and dignity. So Alan, you pushing us, I felt that's a cop-out. Yes, I think there are some specifics we should name and talk about. But I think it's in the heart of the matter where it's transforming relations of power. And they are relations. So engage. Because it's in those relations that the systems are unearthed and made explicit and actually emerge.
Halima, I'm watching time, so we might use these as wind-up comments.
Want a second Graham on that, because something Graham said to me a long time ago, which is repeated today, is how do we hold ourselves accountable to practice, right? And how do we hold ourselves accountable to the values that we're saying are informing our practice? So if we're doing our work based on a value base, on an ideology of we want to be led by those suffering the injustice, and our role then is to support them to get to where they need to get. And that could be different ways, from the local to, and you know, lots of people talk about, oh, we want to localize and we want to work at the local level, but that doesn't just mean we're working at the local level for local issues and local solutions. There's a trajectory that goes upward. So it's about what are the priorities that are emerging from those who are most affected by injustice. And then how do we use our assets and our resources in service of that? How do we make that happen at all levels, right? But going back to what Graham is saying is, if you are committed to a value base, if you're committed to understanding your role as being in service of, then the practice follows from your interactions. And if you are constantly having to say, I don't know what they're doing with our money, it means that you're not invested in their work, right? How close are you to understanding what's happening on that issue or in that space or on the ground? And if you're not close enough, then should you be making the decisions around where funding goes? Or should there be other levels of funding that are closer to where the action is happening? How do we think about, recognizing what are the limitations of our roles? So let's flip the accountability. How accountable are we to understanding what's happening on the ground and then shifting our work to support that? And if we have to constantly ask for these rigid indicators and these technocratic ways of reporting to tell us that this is what's happening, then we have a problem. So I think we have to think about accountability different, and we have to think about how the practices flow. There's no tick box approach. You have to say, what does solidarity in practice look like? And that's a politicized philanthropy. We're not neutral. What does solidarity in practice look like? And then figure out what are the actions that emerge from that. And then how do we change our institutions to be able to enable that? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
The session was a lot. I think just to last comments. When you look at just the funders, the coordinators, NGOs, all of that, and then the community, right? I think we've been talking a lot about going back to humanity, right? And part of that is knowing what you should be accountable for, right? And unfortunately, part of being in an NGO and all of that, you end up needing human resources, right? You end up you have the program manager, you have this, you have that. Then it becomes about money, right? Now everyone is like, you have people who are dependent on the work and not the passion where it all started, the passion of trying to help other people. So I think in every level it goes back to exactly that, the humanity aspect of it. So the funders that you mentioned, are you in touch with the work that you're supporting? Are you aware of what's happening with the people you're supporting? With the NGOs, the organizers and all of that, it shouldn't just be about you now having a position in that organization and knowing that I need to get funding because I need to get paid. I need a salary out of this. Yes, I'll do the work, but like, I also need to get paid, you know? Then all of that leads to then the community on ground level. Are they actually getting assisted with the issues that they have? And also just finding a way as NGOs of bringing about some sort of independence also in our communities, right? Going back to that we've been doing this work without the money, so, you know, when we are we assisting in a way that they will then be able to do this for themselves going forward? If we're saying we're providing sanitary pads, let's say whatever month that was, going forward, what's the plan, right? So two things, I think the humanity aspect of it definitely on all levels, from the funders being invested in the work that they are funding, and getting the results they want because they invested in it. The organizations not only focusing on the funding and the salaries that come with the funding and all of that, the humanity aspect of it, it flows right through. And also finding a way for us to invest in our communities so that they also are able to. Sustainability is such a terrible term. But you know, something like sustainability, being able to sustain themselves. You know? So yeah, no, the humanity aspect of it really is something happened there. It started out with being passion work and like people really investing in it, like, and then it just became work.
So I'm going to, because I sometimes get accused of like, I get recruited for these processes because I have nice conversations. So today I'm going to try to give us some practical stuff to leave with, even though my fellow panelists might not like it. And then I'm going to hand over to Ashley to just do some closing reflections. So in all of the reading that I've done, in all of the conversations that I've had with organizations, both as a grant maker and as a recipient and as somebody who drifts between spaces in the development sector, they do ask for a few concrete things, right? They're very clear, as well from where I sit. Now, I may not have all of them, but these are the 5 important ones from my perspective. First one, simplify. Make the systems for approaching you, receiving money, and managing your grants and compliance as simple as possible, so that it doesn't cost us 20% of our budget to get you the reports. The majority of the money must go through to our programmatic work. Second, fund what's being done. Don't fund your ideas of what you think we should be doing. Understand what we are doing, understand why we're doing it, and fund it if you believe in it. Don't tell us that we need to focus on What's the current one?
Climate change.
Climate change. or anti-racism is coming across the board. You better get your policies ready. Funding what you're doing, funding what is being done, means that you are funding people. People do work. This idea of a 25% human resource overhead is nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. If you pay for 25% of people's time in the year, the other 8 days, nothing happens. So pay. Well, not the other 8 days, the other 4 days. For the rest of the week, nothing will happen. So fund people. Organizations are made up of people. Formations are made up of people. And if we think that we can miraculously drop food out of a plane and it's going to split itself in the air and land miraculously in people's houses, or that we can take a trauma counselor and push them through community and counseling will automatically radiate from them somehow, we're imagining a completely different reality. So we fund people. That is what we fund. The third, flexibility and adaptability. We work in complex systems and complex environments. What we say to you today means nothing tomorrow when the rains start coming in KZN. Or when the first case of monkeypox is in our country. Now what's that one that's coming? Or when my family has a crisis in my own organization and I have to respond to that, which means that your report is not anything of interest or value to me in that moment because I have to go and do something that is important to me. So remember that people live real lives, that the world is changing, it's complex, and your proposal, the minute you click send, is almost valueless because you don't know what you're going to wake up to in the next morning. The fourth, fund in the long term. Organizations have been saying this for decades. We don't need a lot of money, but we do need consistent money. Because if we know we have 20 Rand, we can budget for 20 Rand. And we can budget. It's not because we're poor we can't budget. In fact, poor people budget much better than rich people. So give us 20 Rand on a regular basis, make it consistent, and we can do our work around those things. Don't dump R1 million on me this year and disappear next year because I have to hire 10 people to fill out the forms for the R1 million. And then next year the R1 million is not there and I've got 10 people who are unemployed. We've done fundamental damage not only to the organization, but we've done fundamental damage to our society because we have raised people and dropped them suddenly. The lesson for that is go out, eat a bar, as much sugar as you can, and then go sit still and you'll collapse and fall to sleep in about 20 minutes. We cannot treat our organizations as if they are diabetic. Small amounts of sugar over the long term rather than dump like 5 liters of concentrated Coca-Cola down your throats. Doesn't help anyone. Last, engage more. We think, we plan, we act, we adapt together. Your job is not to police me. Your job is not to make sure that the contracts are dotted and that the I's are crossed and that on the last day of the month we get our receipts photocopied and signed off by what commissioner holds so that we know you didn't steal any money. Your job is to help me deliver the project that we both believe in. And in order for us to do that, we have to engage with each other. We have to talk regularly. We have to understand what is going on in each other's lives, and we have to be able to build solutions together. Back to the really simple principles that were put forward at the beginning of this conversation. Relations founded in our humanity that reinforce dignity. And just the last bit, it will take time, a long time. We don't decide to marry our spouses after 2 days, generally. Generally. We build relationships over a long time before we have trust. It will cost money. It's expensive. Why must we believe that changing the world is going to be cheap? It's expensive. Spend the money. But ultimately, it's worth it. Because we build something new and different and valuable. And that's what I hear from organizations on a repeated basis. I don't have any skin in the game anymore, so I can speak very directly about it. But fundamentally, that's what is being asked of everybody practicing in the development space. Thank you. I hope you found that useful. And we'd ask Ashley to close.
Yeah. I thought I'd been writing notes about my closing reflections, and every time somebody else said it far more eloquently than I did. So I'm not going to make too many reflections, just to say thank you to the panelists. I think you guys have been amazing yet again. I speak to most of them, all of them, quite regularly. And it's the first time anybody's come up with a how-to do list. I'm quite impressed. Usually they ask hard questions and say, you're the director of Ubumbano, you go and find guys. You also raise a lot of questions. But that's what we are, right? Ubumbano it's an evolutionary process. Tomorrow we won't be the same thing we are today. But what I know we will be doing is having difficult conversations. And I say these are difficult because there are some really hard-hitting comments here. In its DNA, Ubumbano is made up of Southern African organizations and European funding organizations. And that's sometimes really hard to navigate because you've got donor and recipient in the same room very often. And the challenge is the same to everybody. To the directors the leaders of NGOs, this is my chairperson here, really keeps me on my toes. But the board is made up of directors of organizations, leaders in civil society. It's also made up of representatives of some of our funders. And they come into that space not as a funder, but as somebody committed, an organization committed to social justice. It's not an easy relationship to manage. I think what you've done today in all your contributions has been to bring some of those perspectives into our minds and to challenge our own thinking. So that's the one thing that you can rely on from Ubumbano, is that we will constantly try and hold spaces where we can have these difficult conversations. And we make some enemies along the way. Some people don't like us very much. But that's okay, because we're trying to develop a more critical reflection on our practice of social justice. It doesn't just take things because it's been done for the last 20 years and therefore we must carry on doing it. Thank you all for coming in person. We've got a drink. It's been a lot of talking, so you're going to just wet the whistle a little bit. We're going to have a small function, small cocktail, just to get to know sundowners. Just to, Tabo, where's it happening?
Just out to the left.
To the left.
Yeah.
So please, I hope you stick around for a while and have a drink and meet some of the team of 3. Zanella and Tabo are the other colleagues. And then our board. Dudu, Roger, Laurel.
Janet was here.
Janet was here. The others unfortunately are online. And to those of you logged on online, I hope you heard us all very clearly. We did 3 rehearsals and it still didn't work properly in the beginning, but I think it worked okay after that. All right, so thank you very much everybody and have a good evening.
Thank you.
So we don't know how, we've got video crew here as you can see. We thought it would be very late, that's I don't want to be late in the meeting. We've got Abel who's been recording our stuff, he's our communications guy. We'll put it together in some form either in writing or in video form, but there will be some record of this. Thank you, everybody.